Oracle of the Forgotten. In the beginning, the early days of the ancient gods. I opened the pages of the first book, eager to learn all that I could. The time of elders began so long ago that none alive recall. Their language is long lost in the dust of stars. Their first universe passed away ages before this one was conceived. It was said that their universe began with the birth of creation and nothingness, with pure essence of energy and soul, that all was formed by an ancient being who has since wandered on to another place to call their own. The elders recall this, but only in the most vague of legends. As a scholar myself, I found it hard to follow even the faint traces of these memories. The most recent events in the history of the Elder Gods began with an introduction of a race we called the Great Scales. Like elder kind, they were ageless among the stars. They explored, grew, even fought wars, and found peace in their own ways. At first, we thought them the most feral of beasts. We sought to tame them, to conquer or use them as tools. It was our own folly, for those great scales were both intelligent and tactically brilliant in a sense we could never have imagined. Our aggression to them cost us several millennia of attempts to form some kind of peace again. It took many trials of strength to even become introduced to their greatest, so that we could attempt this peace. Peace was found, though, and the elders learned just as much from the great scales as the scales would have learned from them. Over the ages, the elders would encounter races that the wayward of their own had created, ones that would later become known as the ancient gods, often shortened to the ancients. Another would be called the Seekers, or Elves in human tongue. Another would be called the War Master Giants, who would later become known as the Dwarves. Each of these are deserving of their own stories, and we'll end up having them later. They aren't all that were created, but by far some of the eldest of their kind. During those times, each of the races appeared at peace with one another, but it was quickly closing upon the ends of the Elder Reign. The War of the Elder Kings was soon to begin. Until that point, the King of Elders met frequently with the ancient and other races. They taught them what they knew of creation and destruction, all but what they considered a critical secret, that all things must end, even, on occasion, the soul itself. This secret would later cost their own kind and so many others in the ages to come. At this time, though, there was peace, calm, and even the elves and dwarves of the age held each other in high respect and regard. The great scales had disappeared into the far reaches where they'd agreed to stay unless they were called upon. The elders led the ancients to create councils to govern over their own people and to work with the other races of the time. During this time, another race was created, the first created by the ancient gods, one with beautiful wings, a variety of colors and designs that reflected the versatile nature of the worlds around them. Leathery wings for difficult environments, beautiful feathered wings for the cold, or for weathering long flights. These were called by many names, but later they would be divided to become the angels and demons. With an influx of new creatures, the universe was beginning to be more and more unstable. A meeting was called where each of the races decided to define godhood, to say what made their people gods or common folk among their race. They spoke softly of the ages to come, of the rules in creating new races and creatures. They came to the conclusion that each creation should be made with care and caution. Around the same times of these talks, great creatures of all manners had been formed. New monsters and ancient beasts for burden, labor, warfare, travel. Their rights began to be defined and determined. The elder law had only one thing to say about these creations. Above all, free will and consent are the most important. Consent is everything. No living soul would be refused the right to consent or revoke their consent. Not to others, not to themselves, not even to fate or the existing gods. This law applied to all creatures with conscience. Any ancient entity that could pass the simple test to prove they were people, as opposed to beasts and monsters. Despite the laws reducing the creations of new races, new creatures became known to the universe. Some thrived, others fell into nothingness. Some began to form of their own accord, spawning as if from the fabric of the universe itself. Their creators remained unknown, and it was decided they simply came to be without guidance. At this time, things stayed mostly in balance. The few imbalances served to fuel the desire to build a better existence for those living in the universe. We hoped for things to stay in balance, but hope is often so far from reality. The time of peace couldn't last forever. While the world outside was peaceful, the elders found themselves at odds with the world within. The kings of elders were any gender, any of their people who had passed the test or been born of the true bloodline of the kings. While occasionally lost, that bloodline often found a way to restore its honor and position. That is, until the fall of the true king. He had reigned long over the entire of their realms. His wife, who was spoken of as the Creator King, was not as often at his side. In these days she was quite busy with the raising of their young heir. Both kings had been killed suddenly in a seemingly random strike against the kingdom. A short time later, their advisor announced the adoption of the young prince. It hadn't been more than a few weeks when the child's death was later announced, leaving the elder people in a state of grief and loss. They had never been without a king. As such, his own son was placed as the heir apparent, with the advisor as the new king in his place. As the years passed, the man's young son became quite close to a teenage boy who had been trained to guard and protect him. Time went by. Both had grown older, and the younger boy learned about the lover of his friend. His friend had told him about their child on the way. Even in these days, the prince was quite young himself. During the reign of the current king, both boys had become close. As time went on, the young prince began to hear whispers of the loss of the previous kings. The woman his father had kept locked away as a personal servant began to tell him stories, talking about the death of her son and husband. The boy listened, shocked by the strange dreams that these encounters would bring. He would see visions of his father, always in the process of executing the two. He thought it simply nightmares. One day she would just disappear, with his father saying only that she had moved beyond this realm. As time continued, he came to know his guard's child and found himself quite protective of her. As he grew older, he finally found the evidence of his own father's crimes, proof that the Creation King had been held captive in a hidden space inside the castle's prisons. The young prince lost his temper. The thought of such a betrayal from a man who was constantly giving speeches about repairing the honor of his people and restoring the kingdom, the hypocrisy was almost too much to bear. It wasn't long before he told his personal guard and dearest friend. The result, though, was not as he expected. The man who had always been so calm flew into a complete rage. He demanded the younger prince take his family and move them far from the palace. By the time the prince returned, the guard had roughed up nearly all of the rest of the guards in the palace just to learn where his own mother had been hidden. Upon hearing the relation between the two, the prince formed his own plan. He could not allow the king beside him to remove the false king. This was his truest friend, and he knew that if he harmed the current king, it would jeopardize the chances at regaining what was rightfully his. Within the day, the false king had been overthrown. His life ended by his own son as punishment for his transgressions against the people of the land. The two kings had found the Creator King. By this time, she was also dying, her soul shattered by the betrayals to her existence. She spoke to her son. What was said may have fallen into ages of dust, or will forever be hidden between the two young adults who had found her together. As per his decision, the young prince took his role as king and turned that role over to his beloved friend. It was a shocking reversal to the people. The king was now the guard, and the guard the king. It didn't take long, though, for others to understand. The old king was exactly that, the king who should have been. For a time, peace was restored again.